The sun disappeared over Sao Paulo at 9:14 in the morning. Not slowly, not like a cloud passing. It just stopped. 1 second the city was bright and loud and smelling of coffee and exhaust. The next, a shadow ate everything, and 8 million people looked up at the same moment and felt the same thing crawl up their spines. Nobody had a word for it yet. 3 seconds later, the same thing happened over Mumbai. Then Lagos, 3 shadows, 3 continents. One single, coordinated moment that told anyone paying attention this was not an accident. This was a statement. The Verk had arrived. Their ships were not the sleek, elegant things humans had imagined in 100 movies and 1,000 novels. They were enormous and dark and looked almost biological, like something that had grown rather than been built. All curved edges and pulsing veins of dull red light running along the hull. Each ship was roughly the size of a small city. There were 11 of them visible from the surface. Satellites picked up 30 more in orbit. No hail, no message, no attempt at contact. Just shadow. Isha Malik was already in the air when the shadow hit Karachi. She was Pakistani Air Force, 29 years old, and had been scrambled out of bed at 4 a.m. by a call that said simply, "Get in the jet, now." She hadn't even laced her boots properly. She was still doing it in the elevator down to the runway. Her squadron, 6 jets, 6 pilots, all people she'd eaten breakfast with 100 times, was the first to get close enough to see the ship clearly. It was the one over the Arabian Sea, drifting slow and massive between Karachi and Mumbai like it owned the water underneath it. Command said, "Do not fire first, get close, get eyes, report back." She got close. The ship didn't even acknowledge them. 6 jets screaming at full speed toward something the size of a mountain, and it just sat there, indifferent, the way a person ignores a fly. Then it fired. She didn't see it happen. She just saw Tariq's jet disappear. Then Nadia's. Then the other 3 gone in the space of 4 seconds, like someone had simply removed them from the world. Her instinct did not say run. Her instinct said report. She yanked the jet into a dive, hit the open channel and talked fast, altitude, angle, weapon type as best she could guess, heat signature, response time, everything she'd seen. She talked while she dove. She talked while the proximity alarm screamed. She talked until the jet caught a shockwave from a second blast and she had to eject. She was still talking into the radio on the way down. The parachute opened. The sea came up slowly beneath her. Above her, the ship continued drifting, slow and massive and completely unbothered. She hit the water. She started swimming toward shore. The United Nations Security Council met 40 minutes after first contact. The room was built for disagreement, and it delivered. Every person in that chamber had a different opinion, a different fear, and a different calculation running in the back of their head. The translator feeds buzzed. Someone's microphone kept cutting out. 3 ambassadors were appearing via screen because they couldn't reach New York. The airspace over half the planet had already been locked down. The Russian delegate said they needed more information before acting. The American delegate said they needed to act before they had more information. The Chinese delegate said both of those things were wrong. Then someone, nobody remembered later who it was, some aide or junior diplomat who shouldn't have been speaking at all, said the word surrender. He said it carefully, reasonably. He said they needed to consider all options. He said that fighting something 11 times the size of their largest naval vessel, something that could make a jet fighter disappear in 4 seconds, was not strategy. It was suicide. The room went quiet. Then the Brazilian delegate, a short woman named Carla Dias, who had been sitting with her arms folded and her jaw tight since the meeting started, looked at the aide and laughed. Not nervously, not politely. She actually laughed, a real full sound that bounced off the walls of that chamber and made 3 ambassadors flinch. "Surrender," she said, like she was tasting a word in a language she didn't speak, to something that didn't even introduce itself. She unfolded her arms and leaned forward. No. In Chicago, the Werk deployed what their military logs classified as a pacification drone. It was not a weapon exactly, not in the way humans thought of weapons. It was more like a system designed to find organized resistance and dissolve it, not through firepower but through disruption, communications, power grids, command structures. It moved through a city the way a virus moves through a body, targeting everything that made coordinated action possible. The Werk had used it on 300 worlds. The average time to full pacification, 6 minutes 14 seconds. They deployed it over Chicago at 10:47 a.m. At 10:53, it was still running. At 10:58, it was still running. At 11:01, 11 minutes and change after deployment, it simply stopped working. Not shut down, not destroyed. It had encountered something it wasn't designed to handle and had, essentially, gotten confused to death. On board the Werk flagship, a young tactical officer named Niccolò stared at his screen and checked the reading 3 times. The drone had stopped because people in Chicago, regular people, not military, not government, had started interfering with its signal manually, individually, in hundreds of different ways, using hundreds of different devices, creating so much messy, uncoordinated noise that the drone's targeting logic had essentially choked on it. They hadn't worked together. There'd been no coordination. They just each, separately, decided to fight back with whatever they had in their hands. Niccolò filed a report. His superior read it, made a note, and filed it under anomalous data. It would not stay there long. The first message from the Werk came at noon. It arrived simultaneously on every functioning communication channel on Earth, radio, internet, satellite, even some systems that technically should not have been able to receive it. It was not long. It said, "You have lost, acknowledge this." In the underground command bunker beneath Brussels, the Joint Emergency Council read it 3 times. Then they drafted a response. The debate about what to say lasted 45 minutes and got heated enough that 2 people had to be separated. In the end, they agreed on 2 words: short, clear, unambiguous. They broadcast it back on every channel. On the Werk flagship, the translation team received the message and ran it through their linguistic database, a system built from the recorded languages of 300 conquered species. The 2 words didn't match anything in the database cleanly. The closest matches were a military refusal term in 11 languages and a deeply vulgar dismissal in 9 others. The lead translator looked at the message for a long time. Then she flagged it as both. Niccolò read the flag. He read the original message. He sat back in his chair slowly. He had studied pre-conquest communications from every species they'd ever encountered. There was a pattern always to how a species responded when they knew they'd lost, a kind of deflation, a grasping, an attempt to negotiate. This was not that. He sent his own report upward. It said, "Recommend immediate xenosociological consultation. Subject species is not behaving within normal parameters." His superior read it, made a note, filed it. Below, on the surface of a planet that had just been told it had lost, a Pakistani pilot dragged herself out of the Arabian Sea onto a fishing dock and wrung out her hair and started looking for a phone. She had more data to report. She had not stopped, not once, thinking about the angle of that weapon discharge. In Lagos, people were already pulling Werk shrapnel out of the walls and taking it apart to see how it worked. In the ruins of a Chicago neighborhood, a 16-year-old had figured out part of why the drone had stopped, written it down in a notebook, and was trying to find someone official to give it to. In Brussels, Carla Diaz was back on the phone, talking fast, building a coalition of people who all agreed on exactly one thing. No. Above them, 37 Verk ships held position in orbit, waiting for the acknowledgement that was not coming, running calculations that kept returning the same answer. And the answer kept being wrong. 6 months in, the Verk stopped calling it a pacification. They didn't have a word yet for what it actually was. The war, if it could be called that, between something with 37 capital ships and something that still ran on fossil fuels in most of its vehicles, had settled into a shape nobody had predicted. Not a collapse, not a surrender, not even a stalemate exactly. More like a bruise that kept getting hit and kept refusing to fade. The Verk controlled the sky. They always had. Anything above 5,000 feet was theirs, their ships, their drones, their absolute and total authority over the upper atmosphere. From up there they could see everything. They could hit almost anything. What they couldn't do was hold the ground. Every time they sent units down, soldiers in armor that could stop a tank round, carrying weapons that rewrote the local geography, they found that the ground had people in it. Not organized armies, not always. Sometimes just people. Farmers who had converted irrigation pipes into something unpleasant. City workers who knew the maintenance tunnels better than any map. Teachers, mechanics, grandmothers. The Verk had studied 300 species. They had a model for every kind of resistance. None of the models fit. Sergeant Darius Acaffer's unit was 12 people. It had been 14. He didn't think about the 2 who weren't there anymore, not in a way he could afford right now, so instead he thought about the mission, which was to destroy a Verk ground installation on the edge of Lagos that had been broadcasting a suppression signal for 6 weeks. The suppression signal didn't hurt anyone directly. It just made every electronic device within 4 kilometers behave randomly and badly, radios cutting out, medical equipment failing, cars refusing to start. In a city already trying to hold itself together with string and willpower, 6 weeks of that had cost lives. Quietly, without drama. The kind of cost you only saw when you looked at which hospital had stopped sending reports. He had 12 people, a truck with 1 working axle, 3 pieces of stolen Verk equipment none of them fully understood, and a chemistry teacher named Fatima who had been making incendiary compounds in her bathroom since week 2. The installation was guarded by 8 Verk soldiers. The math was bad. The math had been bad for 6 months. Darius had stopped doing the math. They hit the installation at 3 a.m. from 4 directions, using the storm drain system that ran under the eastern quarter of Lagos, because Fatima had grown up in that neighborhood and knew it the way she knew her own hands. It lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the installation was gone. So were 4 members of his unit. He stood in the dark in the quiet left behind by the explosion and took a marker from his pocket, a thick permanent marker, the kind used for labeling crates, and wrote 4 names on his left forearm. He didn't cry. There wasn't a rule against it. He just didn't. Then he looked at the remaining 8 people, who were dusty and bleeding and exhausted, and said, "Back to the truck." They went. On the Verk flagship, Kethara was filing her 37th report. She was the fleet's xenosociologist, the only one, because the fleet had never needed more than one, and even one had always felt slightly unnecessary to the Admiralty. Her job, technically, was to observe conquered populations post-pacification and advise on integration strategies. There had been no pacification. Her job had therefore become something else entirely, which was to watch humans and try to explain them, which was the most confusing work she had ever done in her life. The report she was filing now was titled, Anomalous Persistence in Subject Species, Continued Analysis. It was the 37th report with essentially the same title. The data changed. The conclusion stayed the same. They were not stopping. Not because they didn't understand they were losing, they clearly did. Their own communications showed it. They talked about the losses constantly, openly, with a kind of honesty about their own situation that Cathara found almost painful to read. They knew the sky was gone. They knew their armies were outgunned. They knew the Verk ships could, if ordered, reduce any city on the surface to flat glass in under an hour. They knew all of this. And they kept going. Her report asked the question she'd been circling for months. Is there a biological component? Does the subject species lack the neurological signal that tells an organism when continued resistance is futile? She filed it. Her superior sent back a one-line response. Maintain observation. Pacification proceeding on adjusted timeline. She stared at that line for a long time. The adjusted timeline was now 14 months past the original estimate. She opened the Earth Archive, a database her team had been building since before the fleet arrived, pulling from every human communication channel they could access. Broadcasts, internet records, books, films, music. She had been sampling it strategically, picking what seemed relevant. That night, she decided to read the history. All of it. Aisha Malik had been on the ground for 6 months. She was not supposed to be a ground commander. She was a pilot. She thought in 3 dimensions, in speed and angle and fuel load and the clean geometry of the sky. The ground was slow and dirty and full of things you couldn't predict from above. She had 200 people following her through occupied territory, and not one of them was military. There was a retired engineer named Marcus who carried a bag full of tools and had spent 40 years building things and was now spending his retirement very effectively taking things apart. There were teenagers who were faster than anyone at moving through broken urban terrain and had opinions about everything. There were families with children, which was the hardest part, not because the children were difficult, but because every decision Aisha made, she made with the awareness of them at the back of her skull. She navigated by a hand-drawn map she'd gotten from a market woman in the second week. It had been updated so many times in different colored pens that it looked like a piece of abstract art. It was the most valuable thing she owned. Every night they stopped, she spread the map out and they made the next day's decisions together. Not because she believed in democracy particularly. She was military. She believed in chains of command. But because every person in that group knew something she didn't, and she was not stupid enough to waste that. 6 months in, she had not lost anyone she'd started with. She had added 31 people who joined along the way. She did not think about what that meant. She thought about the next day's route. Cathara read for 6 days. She did not sleep much. She ate at her desk. She read human history from the earliest written records to the last broadcasts before the fleet arrived, and when she ran out of text, she started on the films and the music and the artwork, and when that became too much, she went back to the text. She had studied 300 species. She had never read anything like this. Every species she had ever studied, every one had a breaking point. A moment when the cost of continued resistance became larger than whatever was being protected. It was not cowardice. It was biology. It was mathematics. Every living thing with a survival instinct eventually chose survival over the thing it was fighting for. Humans had that instinct. She could see it in the data. They fled. They hid. They experienced fear in ways that were, chemically, nearly identical to other species she'd studied. And then they turned around and went back. Not always, not every one of them, but enough. Enough that 6 months into what should have been a 6-week pacification, the ground was still ungovernable and her fleet was still sitting in orbit recalculating. On the 7th day, her superior summoned her for a status briefing. She sat down across from Admiral Vazquez and delivered her updated assessment in a flat, factual voice. When she finished, the Admiral asked, "And your recommendation?" Cathara looked at him. "We have made a mistake," she said. The Admiral's expression didn't change. "The pacification is proceeding." "The pacification has not proceeded." She kept her voice even. It is not proceeding. It will not proceed on any timeline our models can currently project. You're suggesting we cannot take this planet. I'm suggesting, she said carefully, that we do not yet understand this planet, and that is a different kind of problem. The Admiral looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her to continue her observations and file her reports. She went back to her desk. Below her, in Lagos, in the ruins of an installation that had taken 6 weeks and a specific kind of stubbornness to build, Darius's unit was already 3 kilometers away and moving, 8 names written on his arm, 4 of them in a different ink than the others. He was already thinking about the next installation. He already knew where it was. He already knew they were going. The lab was underground. Under the Ural Mountains, under 300 meters of granite and cold. It smelled like burnt wiring and instant noodles. The lights were too bright in some places and not bright enough in others. There were 6 months of food stored in a room that had once been a Soviet-era bunker, and the heating system made a noise every 4 hours that sounded exactly like someone knocking on the door, which had caused 3 separate panic incidents in the first week before everyone agreed to just live with it. Dr. Unipark had been awake for 22 hours when they finally cracked the shield harmonics. She knew it the moment the numbers came back. She had been looking at those numbers for 4 months, running the same calculations in slightly different configurations, the way you press a bruise to see if it still hurts. And then, at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday with a cold cup of coffee at her elbow, the configuration resolved and the numbers said something different. She sat very still. Then she called across the lab to Dr. Emeka Nwasu, who was asleep on a cot behind a server rack. Emeka. Nothing. Emeka. A noise, movement. Then his head appeared around the server rack, hair flattened on one side, eyes not quite open. If this is about the heating knock, he said, I cannot deal with it. Look at the screen. He looked. He was quiet for a moment that lasted the length of several heartbeats. Then he said a word in Igbo that didn't need translation. Vasily Petrov was not supposed to be there. His official file, the one accessible to government agencies and military contractors, listed him as a disgraced former weapons developer who had been removed from 2 defense programs in the 2030s under circumstances that were described as a fundamental breakdown in ethical alignment, which was a very clean phrase for something that had not been clean at all. He had spent the years since doing consulting work that nobody asked questions about, and drinking, and occasionally doing calculations on napkins that he then threw away, because there was no one left who wanted to hear what he had to say. When the Verk arrived, a woman named Dr. Park had sent him a message that said only, I've read your old papers, come to this location, bring the napkins. He had been in the Ural bunker for 4 months. He was the one who understood the weapon they needed to build best, because he had spent 20 years thinking about weapons that broke things no one thought could be broken, and the Verk shield system was, at its core, just a very sophisticated version of a problem he'd already solved in his head while very drunk in 2031. He was not warm, exactly. He was precise and impatient and used silence the way other people used punctuation. He and Emeka argued every single day about methodology. He and Una did not argue, they had reached, without discussing it, a kind of professional shorthand that cut hours off every conversation. He was the one who brought the coffee without being asked. He was the one who, when Una said, look at the screen, was already standing behind Emeka, having heard the tone in her voice from across the room. He looked at the numbers. He put his hand flat on the desk, very slowly, and leaned on it. Then he said, we need to talk about the test. The weapon was not elegant. It was enormous. The main housing alone was the size of a bus, and had been built from repurposed mining equipment, components cannibalized from 4 different industrial machines, and what Emeka kept calling pure engineering stubbornness, which Vasily said was just a polite name for doing things that shouldn't work until they did. It fired a precisely calibrated pulse that, if the numbers were right, would match the resonant frequency of the Werk shield system and essentially shake it apart from the inside. Clean, in theory, completely dependent on the targeting being exact. The problem was that someone had to be inside the target zone to calibrate the initial pulse. Not at the edge of it, inside it, close enough to the weapon's discharge that the calibration sensors could read the shield response and adjust in real time. It wasn't a death sentence. Probably. The math said 63% survival probability if the person was wearing the right equipment and the pulse duration was kept under 4 seconds. 63%. They all knew what 63% meant. They'd been doing math for months. They were all very good at it. Yuna was looking at the table when Vasily said, "I'll do it." Emeka started to say something. "I'll do it," Vasily said again, not loudly, and the tone of it stopped Emeka mid-breath. He didn't explain. He just started going over the equipment list for what the person inside the zone would need to wear. Nobody asked him why. Some things you feel the weight of without needing the words. The test worked. That was the clean version of what happened. The weapon fired, Vasily was in the zone, the pulse calibrated correctly, the shield resonance matched, and 3 seconds later the system collapsed. Clean. The less clean version, the pulse ran 4 seconds and 8/10, not 4 seconds, 4 seconds and 8/10. He came out of it walking, talking. He sat down in a chair and Yuna handed him water and he drank it and said the calibration data looked correct and that they should run the numbers again before the first field deployment. He did not mention the 8/10. Neither did she. She put his name at the top of the equipment log in her own handwriting, very clearly, because she believed that precision applied to everything, including who had been where and what it had cost them. The first field deployment was against a Werk capital ship sitting at low orbit over Eastern Europe. It took 11 people to carry the weapon components to the deployment site in the Polish countryside, assembled over 2 days in a barn, aimed upward at something that was, from the ground, just a dark smear across the sky that occasionally blotted out stars. The pulse fired at dawn. The ship's shields came apart in exactly the way the numbers said they would. Then the second weapon, smaller, conventional, the kind humanity had been building for 100 years, did the rest. The capital ship fell in pieces over a stretch of uninhabited forest. It burned for 3 days. The smoke was visible from Warsaw. Word spread the way word spreads when people are desperately waiting for it, fast and ragged, and not always accurate, but carrying the thing everyone needed most, which was evidence that the math could go the other way. The Werk lost a second ship 6 weeks later. A third 2 weeks after that. On the flagship, Admiral Vazquez called Cathara in. She stood across the desk from him and read his face, something she had become skilled at in the years of working under people who considered her work optional, and understood before he spoke that he was no longer dismissing her. "They've developed a shield countermeasure," he said. "Yes. Your assessment." She had been preparing for this conversation for 4 months, which was how long she'd known it was coming. She had the words ready and organized, precise and factual, and she delivered them that way, the way you hand someone something fragile. When she finished, the Admiral was quiet for a long time. "What would it take," he said slowly, "to break them?" Cathara looked at him. She thought about the history she had read, all of it, every page. "I don't know," she said. "I'm not sure there's an answer to that question." "Everything breaks." "Yes," she said, "but some things when they break don't stop." She requested permission to make direct contact with the human leadership. He denied it. She went back to her desk and began composing the message anyway. In Lagos, Darius was adding no new names. He had hit 4 more installations in 2 months. All 4 gone. His unit was up to 16 now. People kept joining who had heard what they were doing and showed up and simply refused to leave. He hadn't lost anyone in 6 weeks. He didn't say that out loud. He was not the kind of person who said things like that out loud. He just noticed it quietly, the way you notice a tooth that has stopped aching, with a kind of disbelief so careful it barely counts as relief. On the coast, Aisha had finally reached the water. She stood on a dock in the gray morning air and looked at 200 people getting onto boats, tired and dirty, and more alive than they had any statistical right to be. And then she turned and looked back at the burning city behind her. 1 second. She turned back and got on a boat. The water was cold and the boat was crowded, and somewhere in the middle of the group, someone started talking about what food they'd eat first when this was over, and other voices joined in. And the conversation got heated and specific in the way conversations do, when people are holding onto the future with both hands. Aisha listened. She did not look back at the city again. She thought about the angle of the stars, which were visible out here over the water, and about what it would feel like to be back in the sky. She thought about what she'd have to fly through to get there. She already knew it was worth it. She was already working out how. The ceasefire lasted exactly long enough to arrange the meeting. Neither side called it a ceasefire in official communications. The Werk called it a tactical pause for data acquisition. The Joint Human Command called it a cessation of active operations pending dialogue. Both phrases were ways of saying the same thing, which was that both sides needed to sit in a room together, and neither side wanted to admit they needed it. The location was a converted cargo ship in the North Atlantic, chosen because it belonged to no country, could be seen clearly from satellite, and had a large enough meeting room. It had been a grain hauler before the war. It still smelled, faintly, of wheat. Kethara arrived first. She stood on the deck in the cold Atlantic wind and looked at the water, which was gray and restless, and nothing like the temperature-controlled interiors she had lived in for 4 years. Her people did not do cold well. She felt it in her joints, in the thin membranes of her ears, in the tips of her 4 fingers. She stayed on the deck anyway. She wanted to see the surface. The actual surface with actual weather on it before the humans arrived. She had read about the Atlantic. She had seen images. It was different to stand next to it, larger in the way that things in real life are always larger than their representations, and angrier and grayer. She was still on the deck when the human delegation's helicopter appeared on the horizon. There were 5 of them. Aisha Malik, who was now officially a flight commander but was wearing civilian clothes because she'd been told the meeting would go better without uniforms. She had not argued. She had simply put on civilian clothes while internally disagreeing with every word of the advice. Darius Akafar, who had been flown in from Lagos 24 hours earlier and had spent most of that time sleeping on a military transport, which was the best sleep he'd had in months. He was wearing his jacket with the names written on the lining, which nobody official had approved or asked about. Dr. Una Park, who had brought a leather folder full of technical documents and a specific kind of silence around her that had nothing to do with shyness. A diplomat named Rashid Farouk, who had been doing this work for 30 years and had the face of a man who had heard every variety of bad news and had learned to nod at all of them with the same measured expression. And Carla Diaz, who was there because she had said no in that Security Council chamber 18 months ago and had been saying it in various forms ever since. And the Joint Command felt that her presence in the room would communicate something that couldn't be put in a briefing document. They sat down across from Kethara and 2 Werk military observers whose job was to take notes and say nothing. Rashid opened. Cathara responded. For an hour they talked about frameworks and conditions and the language of temporary arrangements. It was careful and correct and said almost nothing. Rashid was very good at this. Cathara had prepared for it. Everyone in the room understood that this was the outer shell of the conversation, and they were all waiting in their different ways for someone to crack it. Cathara cracked it. She set down the tablet she'd been reading from and looked at the humans across the table, really looked, in the way she'd been studying them for 18 months from a distance, and asked her question. Why didn't you stop? The room went quiet. Aisha answered first, because she was the kind of person who moved into silence before she'd fully decided what to say. She told Cathara about her squadron, about Tariq and Nadia and the others, gone in 4 seconds, about hitting the water and swimming to shore and starting to think about the angle of the weapon discharge before she'd even stopped coughing up seawater. She didn't say she hadn't been afraid. She had been afraid. She said that. She said the fear had been present the entire time, like weather, and she had moved through it the way you move through weather because there was somewhere she needed to be. Stopping, she said, felt like a different kind of dying. Darius answered second. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke, looking at his hands on the table, and when he talked it was not in the diplomatic register that Rashid had been using. It was plain. He told her about Lagos, about the 4 names on his arm and the market women who'd given him maps and the chemistry teacher who'd made things in her bathroom that should have required a factory. He told her about the 16 people who were currently in Lagos right now, doing the same work, while he sat here on a grain hauler in the Atlantic. Those people, he said, are the reason. Not an abstract reason, not a principle or a concept. Specific people whose names he knew, whose faces he could describe, whose survival was the number he was doing the math for. Cathara listened to both of them and said nothing. Then she looked at Yuna. Dr. Park, why didn't you stop? Yuna opened the leather folder. She took out a photograph printed on paper, not a screen, which required deliberate effort in a world that had largely stopped printing, and placed it flat on the table between them. It was a photograph of Vasily Petrov. He was standing in the bunker lab, holding a coffee cup, not smiling, looking at something off camera with the expression he wore when he was thinking through a problem. Someone had caught him in a moment he wasn't performing for. Yuna did not say anything. She left the photograph on the table. Cathara looked at it for a long time. The 2 Verk observers were taking notes with the speed and volume of people who had not expected to need this much space. Cathara asked her follow-up question carefully. She had been thinking about it for weeks, constructing it and dismantling it and reconstructing it, trying to get the shape right. If we had never attacked, she said, what would you have been? She wanted to understand whether the resistance was something humans became under pressure, or something they simply were. The room sat with the question. Darius answered. He had not planned to speak a second time. Rashid had prepared for this and had a prepared answer, but Darius got there first, and what he said was not a prepared answer. Exactly this, just quieter about it. Cathara looked at him. She had read 18 months of human history. She had read the wars and the rebuilding after wars and the arguments about rebuilding and the art made about the arguments. She had read about species within the species, the divisions and the conflicts and the things humans had done to each other over the course of their history, which were not small. And yet here they sat, unified in a way her own fleet, which had a common purpose and a common enemy and a command structure, was not quite unified. You fight each other, she said. Yes. Extensively. Often. But not now. Darius looked at her steadily. We have an outside problem. You will go back to fighting each other, after. Probably, he said, in the tone of someone who considers this a reasonable prediction rather than a damning one. But that's our fight. You don't get a vote. On the Verk flagship, the admiral was receiving the live translation feed from the meeting. He read it in silence. He had been reading it for 2 hours. He was very still. Cathara took a breath and said the thing she had come here to say. She told them what the Verk fleet was authorized to do to planets that successfully resisted the pacification phase. She said it plainly, in clear language, without the diplomatic softening that Rashid would have used. She had decided the softening would not serve anyone in this room. The room absorbed it. It was very quiet on the grain hauler. The sea knocked against the hull. Somewhere in the ship something metal creaked. Rashid's face did not change. His note-taking hand did not slow. 30 years of this. Carla Diaz closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. Una Park looked at the photograph of Vasily Petrov, still on the table. Aisha looked at Darius. He looked back at her. Something passed between them that was not a conversation. Just two people who had been doing the math for 18 months and had just been given a new number and had already, without speaking, started recalculating. He looked back at Cathara. He cracked his knuckles, one slow, deliberate sound. "All right," he said, "then we're not done." Cathara looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than the words. Then she said, "No, you're not." She reached into the folder she had carried onto the grain hauler and withdrew a data chip and set it on the table. "This contains everything I have: fleet positions, weapon systems, command structure, authorization codes for the orbital suppression network." Rashid looked at it, then at her. "Why?" Cathara was quiet for a moment. She looked around the room, at the 5 humans sitting across from her, at the photograph still lying on the table, at the gray water visible through the porthole behind them. "Because," she said, "I read your history, all of it." A pause. "And I have decided I would rather be on the side that remembers." The two Verk observers looked at each other. Their notes, for the first time in the meeting, stopped. The counteroffensive was not a single battle. It was 100 decisions made by exhausted people in bad lighting, over the course of 9 weeks, using information from a chip given to them by an alien xenosociologist on a grain hauler in the North Atlantic. It was Una Park's team building 3 more shield crackers in 4 weeks, one in the Urals bunker, one in an underground facility in New Mexico, one on a converted fishing trawler off the coast of Japan, because dispersal was survival, because they had learned that lesson early and at a cost they did not need to repeat. It was Darius and his unit, now 40 people, moving through the parts of Lagos that the Verk thought were still theirs and learning, very quickly, that they were wrong. It was Aisha Malik getting back into the air. She had been on the ground for 18 months. The plane they gave her was not the jet she'd flown in the first week. That was at the bottom of the Arabian Sea somewhere. This was a retrofitted interceptor, heavier than what she was used to, with a targeting system that had been rebuilt from pieces of 3 different aircraft and a Verk sensor array that Cathara's data had taught them how to work. The cockpit smelled like the jacket. She had kept it, a co-pilot's jacket, someone who had been in the air with her in the 3rd month and hadn't come back. She had never returned it because returning it had never become possible. The jacket lived in her quarters, then in her pack, and now it was here in the cockpit, because she had stuffed it behind the seat without thinking and then left it there because removing it felt wrong. She ran through her pre-flight checks. Standard. Routine. The kind of routine that 18 months of not doing it could not erase, because some things, once learned, sit in the hands rather than the head. She went through the checks and did not think about what was above her. Then the radio clicked and said, "Falcon lead, you are clear," and she stopped, not thinking about it. The plane moved, the runway disappeared, the ground dropped away. She was in the air. Above her, the Verk ships were still there, smaller now, after the losses, but still enormous, still dark, still carrying the dull red veins of light along their hulls. She had looked up at them for 18 months from the ground. From above, from below them, with the sky around her and the controls in her hands, they looked different. Not smaller, but different. She had her angle. The first shield cracker fired at a capital ship over Western Europe at dawn on a Thursday, which was not chosen for symbolic reasons, but because that was when Yuna's team was ready, and Yuna's team did not wait for symbolism. The shields came apart. The ship came down. It fell in pieces over the English Channel and burned for 2 days. The second cracker, the one on the fishing trawler off Japan, fired 14 hours later. Different ship, same result. The Werk fleet responded the way they always responded, which was with coordinated firepower and tactical speed, because they were very good at war. They had been doing it for 300 conquests. They knew what to do when a situation changed. What they did not know how to do was find a weapon that existed in 3 locations and had already been moved before they could triangulate it. They had learned a lot about human warfare in 18 months. They had not learned that humans move things before they need to. The third shield cracker was already assembled in an entirely different location, and it fired a week later. On the flagship, Admiral Vazquez read the reports from the tactical desk in silence. He had been reading reports like this for weeks. Each one was a version of the same shape. A thing that was supposed to be contained had expanded. A thing that was supposed to be over was not over. A calculation that should have resolved had not resolved. He thought about what Kethara had said to him weeks ago in his office. Some things, when they break, don't stop. He had not believed it at the time. He believed in breaking. He had spent his career engineering it, the careful, systematic dismantling of resistance until nothing remained. It worked because the math worked. Every civilization had a limit. Every organism had a point beyond which continued effort was biologically irrational. He had simply never met something that disagreed with the math and kept going anyway. He called a command meeting. He looked at the people around the table, experienced, capable, the best the Werk fleet had, and he asked them the question he had been not asking for 6 months. Can we win this? The room was quiet. He looked at each face. He had known these people for years. They were not cowards. They were not unintelligent. They were people who had done this 300 times and knew what winning looked like. None of them answered yes. Darius breached the Werk Ground Command Center in Lagos at night. The building had been a government administrative complex before the war. The Werk had taken it early, second week, and converted it into the nerve center for their entire ground operation in West Africa. Taking it would not end the war, but it would end a specific chapter of it, the one where Lagos was divided between what was theirs and what wasn't. 40 people, 1 building. He went in last. Old habit, not a rule. He had never made it a rule, never said it out loud, just found himself always at the back of any entry, the last one through the door, because someone had to be last, and he had decided without deciding that it would be him. The operation lasted 43 minutes. When it was over, the building was theirs. He stood in the former command center, a large room full of alien equipment. Screens still live with Werk data feeds, the air carrying the faint electromagnetic smell that alien tech always had, and looked at his people and thought, everyone. Everyone was here. He did not say it. He went to the nearest screen and started going through the data with the person who knew the systems best, because there was work to do and information to extract, and the night was not finished. But he thought it. Everyone. The formal demand for Werk's surrender was broadcast on a channel that Kethara had provided, a command-level frequency that went directly to the Admiral's desk without routing through lower communication layers. It arrived at 6 a.m. fleet time. The Admiral read it. He sat with it for 11 minutes. 11 minutes was how long the pacification drone had run in Chicago before it stopped. Nobody on the human side knew this was the number. Nobody had chosen it. It was simply how long it took. He opened a response channel. He sent 2 words in the Werk command language. "We acknowledge." The aftermath was not clean. Nothing that is real is clean. The sky over 3 continents was still the wrong colors, a chemical effect from the early orbital bombardments that would take years to fully clear. Large sections of cities were gone, not damaged but simply gone, in ways that would require decades, and a kind of communal effort that humanity would have to decide together whether it was willing to make. Billions of people were building lives in the gaps where other lives had been. The rebuilding would be the longest part. The rebuilding would outlast everyone who had fought. Cathara came to the surface 3 days after the surrender. She was the first Werk to stand on the actual ground of Earth, not a structure, not a ship, but the actual dirt and rock of the planet, under the actual sky that she had been watching from orbit for 2 years. She stood in Lagos, because that was where the Joint Command had asked her to come, and she looked at what her fleet had done to it, the gaps in the skyline, the streets still in the process of being cleared, the marks on buildings that wouldn't be painted over yet because there was other work to do first. Nobody stopped her from standing there. Nobody led her away from it. Nobody helped her either. They let her look. After a while, Darius came and stood nearby, not to say anything, just because someone had asked him to be available if she had questions. She had one. "How do you do it?" she said. She was still looking at the street. "Know what you lost and continue." Darius looked at the same street. "You don't stop knowing," he said. "You just keep moving alongside it." She didn't answer. He didn't expect her to. That night, Aisha and Darius and Yuna sat on the roof of a building in Lagos that was mostly intact. No meeting, no debrief, no agenda. Someone had found a bottle of something and 3 cups, and the night was warm and the air smelled like the city healing underneath them, and the stars were visible, actually visible, which had not always been the case, because the orbital activity of the Werk fleet had interfered with visibility from the surface. Different stars now, ones they knew the names of. Or rather, the same stars, just ones they understood better than before, because they knew what was in between them now, knew there were routes out there that ships moved along, knew that the dark was not empty the way they used to think it was empty. They sat for a long time without talking. Then Yuna said, "She filed it." They both knew what she meant. Cathara's final report to the Werk archive. It had been shared with the human scientific community as a condition of the settlement, full disclosure, both ways. "Have you read it?" Darius asked. "The summary." And Yuna was quiet for a moment. "She called us the first species they encountered that required a new category." A pause. "She said the existing framework for conquered species didn't apply because we never functioned like a conquered species." Darius thought about that. What category did she make? "She didn't name it," Yuna said. "She left that field blank." The bottle moved. The city breathed underneath them. Somewhere a few blocks away something structural was being worked on through the night, because some of the people doing the rebuilding had decided that nighttime was not a reason to stop. Aisha looked at the stars. She thought about the first day, the squadron, Tariq, Nadia, the 4 seconds it took, the water coming up at her fast as she fell. She thought about the angle of the weapon discharge that she had filed a report on while the parachute opened. She thought about getting back in the air 3 weeks ago, and what it felt like to be above the ships instead of below them. She thought about the jacket behind her seat. "She should have named it," Aisha said. "What would you call it?" Darius asked. She thought. "Still here," she said. Somewhere in the Werk archive, in a report filed by a xenosociologist who had defected, and then been quietly reinstated as part of the settlement negotiations, whose final addendum to her work on humanity had been read by more members of the Werk command structure than any document in the last decade. The last line of the conclusion said this: "Do not touch them, not because they are powerful, because they remember, and because remembering for this species is not something that makes them slow. It is what makes them move." The field for species category was blank. It stayed blank. Some things do not fit in existing boxes. Some things, when they break, do not stop. They just become something new, and keep going under different stars, into the dark that is no longer quite as empty as it used to be.